The tower had always stood. Long before any living soul in the village was born, long before their fathers and grandfathers, the tower rose on the hill. Its stones were blackened by centuries of wind and rain, its base rooted deep in the bedrock. It carried no banners, no watchman patrolled its height, and yet it was the village's measure and mark. At dusk, when the sun sank behind the ridge, its bell tolled, marking the end of labor. At dawn, the first stroke woke the people from their beds. And at night, when fear of darkness grew heavy, its high window shone faint with the glow of an oil lamp, a steady flame that reassured all below. The tower stood, and so order remained. Children grew up under its shadow, taking for granted that its presence meant safety. Women prayed with their eyes lifted to its silent stones, as though the tower itself bore witness. Men measured their days by its bell and their years by the seasons it had overseen. To live in the village was to live in the tower's gaze. The seasons came and went, and the tower never changed. Its stones did not crumble, its bell never cracked. Even in storm and fire, when roofs were torn and crops drowned, the flame in the window burned on, small but unyielding. Some called it holy. Others whispered of secrets hidden in its walls. But whether divine or profane, no one questioned its permanence. It was the anchor of their world, immovable and eternal. And so when the first shadow passed across its crown, no one thought to fear. It began with a single bird. One morning, as the bell tolled, a raven wheeled above the tower. Its wings cut across the pale sky, its cry harsh and hollow. The people noticed, but they did not linger on it. Ravens were common enough in the fields and woods. They perched on scarecrows, fed on scraps at the edge of the village. What harm was one bird circling the tower? By the next day, there were 3. They came at dawn, their black shapes stark against the lightning sky. They circled, wide and deliberate, and though the bell rang as always, their call seemed to echo louder than its toll. Children pointed upward, laughing at their noise. The elders frowned but said nothing. Soon there were more. A dozen, perhaps more still, gathering without warning as the sun climbed. They rose from the hills, from the woods, from nowhere the eye could trace, and joined their fellows above the tower. The air filled with the sound of their wings, the rush and beat like a storm approaching. Men paused at their plows to listen. Women halted at the well, pails suspended in midair, ears straining. Even the cattle lifted their heads uneasily, their hides twitching at the sound. The sky grew restless with wings, darkening the air above the hill. Yet the birds never perched. They did not rest on the battlements, did not cling to the stones. They only circled, as though held to an invisible path. Around and around, always the same arc, always above the tower. Whispers began. Some said they were waiting for something. Others murmured of omens, of death carried on black wings. Still others forced a laugh, insisting it was nothing more than birds gathering for autumn flight. But in the eyes of the villagers, unease had begun to take root. For the flame in the tower's window flickered that night, guttering as though the air around it had grown heavy. And at its crown, the dark shapes wheeled still, their cries carrying through the long hours. By the 7th day, the sky above the tower was no longer its own. The ravens had multiplied beyond counting. They came not in pairs or dozens but in waves, rolling across the horizon until the very air seemed filled with their wings. Their cries poured down like a storm of voices, hoarse, grating, endless. From dawn until dusk, they circled. Around and around the tower, their bodies stitched into a ring of shifting black. At times the sun broke through, pale and weak, but more often the sky seemed swallowed. Shadows fell across the village though no cloud passed overhead. The bell still rang, but its voice no longer carried. Each time the great tongue struck, the sound dulled, swallowed before it could travel down into the streets. The villagers strained to hear, but the cawing of the ravens drowned it, mocking, relentless. Fear took hold. Children cried at night, saying the birds pressed against their windows with beaks and claws. Women muttered prayers under their breath, clutching charms, sprinkling salt at their thresholds. Men who once laughed at omens now spoke in hushed tones, avoiding the hill, refusing to look up. At dusk, when the tower's flame should have shone steady in the high window, the people gasped. The light trembled, flickered, dimmed, until it was no more than a faint glow, smothered by the thick veil of wings. The ring of ravens closed tight, their bodies blotting the sky, their shadows spilling over roofs and fields alike. Some swore the air itself had grown heavier, pressing down on chest and bone. Others claimed time slowed, the hours of night stretching longer, the dawn reluctant to come. The old ones remembered tales they had never wished to recall, of towers marked, of birds as heralds of endings. And though they whispered softly, their words spread quickly. The ring was not flight. It was a circle drawn, a seal of shadow. And nothing kept within such a circle could endure. That night the village discovered the true cost of the circling birds. At first it seemed a trick of draught or carelessness. A candle sputtered in a cottage window, its flame shrinking, then dying though no wind touched it. A woman muttered, struck flint again, coaxed the wick alight, only to watch it wither once more, smoke curling into the dark. Elsewhere, a man lit his oil lamp. The flame caught, flared briefly, then guttered out, leaving the glass blackened, the room darker than before. He cursed, tried again, but each time the same. No fire would last. By the second hour after sundown, the truth was undeniable. The houses that had glowed with points of light sank into shadow. Candles, torches, lanterns, hearths, none held their flame. The villagers struck spark after spark, flint against steel, but the fire hissed and died as though choked by unseen hands. Only embers remained, glowing faintly, fading quickly. Fear spread like sickness. Children whimpered in their mothers' arms, whispering of claws scratching at the shutters. Old men clutched their pipes, staring into the black where smoke should have risen. Young men shouted in frustration, slamming doors, throwing tinder into hearths that refused to burn. And above it all, the ravens circled. Their cries seeped through the night, muffled yet constant, as if each caw pressed against the houses like a knock upon the walls. The ring over the tower did not break. Wings beat ceaselessly in the dark sky, and no flame answered them. The people gathered in the square, carrying the last of their torches. They huddled close, shielding the wavering light with their bodies. Yet one by one, the torches dimmed. The last sputtered in the mayor's hand, shrank to a thread of red, and died before all eyes. The crowd gasped as darkness swallowed them whole. There was no fire. No light. Only the circling of wings above the hill, black against a sky that refused to part. And in that endless dark, the villagers began to understand. Night could outlast them. The village had known dark nights before. Storms that blotted out moon and stars, winters when clouds pressed heavy against the hills, nights when wolves prowled beyond the fences and men dared not sleep. But even then, there had been fire. Even in fear, there had been the red comfort of a hearth, the warm pulse of light that kept the shadows at bay. Now there was nothing. The darkness was thick, unnatural. It pressed into the cottages, into the lungs, into the marrow of bone. No spark endured. No candle lifted its glow. The villagers sat huddled together, blind to one another's faces, their voices hushed, as though even a whisper might draw something closer. Time stretched. Minutes dragged into hours, hours into something slower still. Mothers rocked their children, yet the children did not sleep, their eyes were wide and glistening, though no light touched them. Old men muttered prayers, their words thin and rasping. Young men clenched their fists, but the anger drained quickly, replaced by silence. Outside, the wings never ceased. The circling of the ravens was a constant murmur overhead, like waves breaking against stone, relentless and eternal. Sometimes their cries sharpened, harsh and jarring, echoing through the black. Sometimes they fell quiet, and that silence was worse, for in it the villagers heard only their own heartbeats, loud and frantic. No one knew how long it lasted. Dawn did not come. The night deepened, stretching past its bounds, a vast curtain that refused to lift. Men who counted the hours by the ringing of the tower bell found nothing to measure, for the bell was silent, smothered beneath the storm of wings. Women who prayed for the sun to rise found only darkness pressing heavier against their windows. It was a night without end. A night without fire. The people of the village would later say that time itself had faltered, that the ravens had stolen the turning of the world. And in their memories, all that remained of that night was a weight, the weight of sitting powerless in a darkness that had no mercy, no shape, no limit. The longest of nights. When the night would not break, the people turned to prayer. The church, small but steadfast, had always been the heart of the village. Its altar candles had burned through feast and famine, through storm and sickness. If light failed elsewhere, it was there that fire had endured. And so, in the longest night, the villagers gathered at its doors, stumbling through the dark, guided only by memory and touch. They crowded the pews, shoulders pressed tight, the air thick with breath and fear. Mothers clutched their children close, men gripped their caps with shaking hands. The priest moved slowly to the altar, his robes brushing against the stone floor. He set the great candles in their holders, lifted flint and steel, and struck. The spark leapt, the wick caught, then guttered out. A murmur rippled through the crowd. The priest struck again, harder, his hands trembling. The wick glowed, a tongue of fire rose, flickered, and died. Smoke curled upward, thin and mocking. Some cried aloud. Others pressed their foreheads into their hands. The priest struck again and again, until his knuckles split and bled, but each flame withered as quickly as the last. The altar stood in darkness, its cold stone bare. Then the voices began. At first a whisper, then a rising tide, prayers muttered, shouted, pleaded. Some knelt and pressed their palms to the floor. Others tore at their clothes, lifting their arms to the heavens. A few dragged animals to the steps, whispering of sacrifice, their knives flashing briefly in the dark before the beast's cries were swallowed by the endless black. And still the ravens circled. Their call seeped through the roof, echoing in the rafters like a chorus of jeers. No prayer silenced them. No sacrifice broke their ring. The villagers wept. The priest sank to his knees before the cold altar, his voice hoarse. And in that moment, the people knew what they had refused to believe. There would be no light. Not from fire, not from heaven, not from the tower that had once marked their days. Only the endless dark, and the beating of wings above. At last, the wings fell silent. It came not with thunder nor with storm, but with a stillness so deep it struck the villagers like a blow. The endless cawing ceased. The beating of feathers faded. When the people crept from their homes, blinking into the pale light, the sky was empty. The ravens were gone. But the day was no day as they had known it. The sun rose weak, its light washed pale, unable to warm the fields or scatter the shadows. The air itself seemed thinner, stretched, fragile. The villagers stood in the streets, their eyes hollow from the long night, their voices hushed as if afraid the silence might break. They looked to the tower. It stood black against the sky, stripped of its certainty. The high window where the lamp had burned was dark. No flame glowed. No smoke rose. The bell hung still. For the first time in memory, the tower gave nothing, no light, no sound, no measure of time. The people waited. They struck flint against steel, lit wicks, touched fire to dry straw. But as in the night, the flames faltered, flickered, and died. Even beneath the pale daylight, no candle held. Torches dwindled. Hearths lay cold. The children asked when evening would come, when the lamps would burn again. No one answered. The elders lowered their heads. The priest stood silent before the altar, its stone bare, its candles black. From that day, the village marked time differently. No longer by the tower's bell, no longer by the flame in its high window. Instead, they measured their lives by what had been lost, by the night that stretched beyond its bounds, by the fire that would not burn, by the ring of wings that once encircled the sky. And though the ravens never returned, their shadow remained. For whenever dusk fell, the people shivered, clutching one another in the dark, knowing that the longest night had not ended. It had only taught them how fragile the light had always been.